Have you ever wondered how Native Americans slept in frozen forests? Their methods are still shocking today. Before us is a forest bound by frost, where temperatures drop to levels that are deadly for the unprepared. In this world, there are no modern sleeping bags, thermal underwear, or insulated tents. There is only snow, wind, and cold that penetrates to the bone. It is in these conditions that the indigenous peoples of North America have survived and thrived for thousands of years. Their ability to sleep warmly in the middle of a frozen forest seems almost supernatural. But behind this were not miracles, but profound knowledge honed to perfection. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn how Native Americans used the earth itself as a heating pad, and what type of fire could keep a person warm all night long with almost no supervision. What if I told you that everything you believed about surviving in the cold is wrong? For Native Americans, winter was not an enemy to be fought. It was a natural part of life that simply required the right preparation. The key was not to react to the cold, but to anticipate it and act proactively. Preparations for winter began long before the first snowfall. It was a methodical and calm process based on the experience of hundreds of generations. They did not view the forest as a collection of dangers, but as a storehouse of resources. Every fallen tree, every type of snow, every low-lying area had its purpose. Understanding these nuances was the basis of their survival strategy. Their approach was holistic. Not only physical warmth was important, but also psychological calm. Panic and fear in the cold are sure companions of death. Therefore, knowledge and confidence in one's abilities were valued above all else. Instead of building complex and cumbersome shelters, they used minimalist but ingeniously effective solutions. Why waste energy on something that can be done more easily? This principle was at the heart of many of their techniques. They understood that the main source of heat was not so much a fire as their own bodies. Therefore, the main task was not to warm up from the outside, but to preserve the heat that was already there. All their clothing and shelters were built on this principle. It was a philosophy of deep integration with nature, not domination over it. They did not conquer winter, but became part of it, using its own laws to their advantage. It was this approach that allowed them to succeed. Unlike modern survival, which often boils down to a set of gadgets and techniques, their system was a way of life. They did not survive in the forest. They lived in it, and winter was just one of the seasons in their home. This philosophy allowed them to expend a minimum of energy and achieve maximum results. They did not fight the elements, but directed their power to their advantage. This was their main secret. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other survival secrets from the past. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this philosophical approach to survival in extreme conditions? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about how to build a warm shelter out of snow and branches? The first and most important task in the cold was to shelter from the wind. It is the wind that robs the body of heat at a catastrophic rate, making even moderate frost deadly dangerous. The simplest shelter was a barrier made of tightly packed fir or pine branches. It was built on the windward side of the sleeping area, creating a calm zone. This simple action significantly increased the chances of a comfortable night's sleep. A more reliable option was a single slope shelter known as a lean-to. Two sturdy branches were stuck into the snow, and a horizontal crossbar was placed on top of them. Other branches were leaned against this base at an angle, creating a sloping wall. The secret of a warm shelter was in its covering. On the outside, it was covered with a thick layer of snow, which served as an excellent windbreak and heat insulator. The snow prevented the wind from blowing through the shelter, keeping the air inside warmer. The inside of the shelter was lined with a thick layer of pine branches. The needles created an air gap that insulated it from the cold ground and snow wall. The thicker this layer was, the warmer it was to sleep. In deep snow conditions, snow trenches or caves were often dug. Snow, especially dense snow, is an excellent insulator. Inside such a shelter, the temperature could be significantly higher than outside. The main rule when building any shelter is that it should be small. The smaller the interior space, the easier it is to warm it with your own body heat or a small fire. A large shelter would require too much energy to heat. The entrance to such a shelter was always located on the leeward side and was made as small as possible. Sometimes it was even covered with a skin or a thick layer of branches. This prevented warm air from escaping. The location of the shelter was also of great importance. It was never built in an open area or on top of a hill. The ideal location was a low-lying area protected from the wind by trees or folds in the terrain. Such a simple shelter, built in an hour from materials at hand, became a reliable home for the night. But even the best shelter is useless without the right source of heat. What if I told you that the Indians knew the secret of a fire that could burn all night and heat, as well as a modern stove? What I am about to show you was one of the best-kept secrets of the forest peoples. It is the technique of the long fire, or nodia, which allowed them to sleep in the cold without constantly adding wood to the fire. It did not require strength, but precision and knowledge of the physics of fire. The basis of such a fire was 2 or 3 long, thick logs of dry, resinous pine or spruce. The diameter of the logs could reach 30 to 40 centimeters. It was their size and the type of wood that were the key to long and even burning. On one side of each log, along its entire length, notches were made with an axe. This created an uneven surface that ignited more easily and maintained combustion better. The work was painstaking, but necessary for the entire system to function properly. In the simplest version, 2 logs were laid parallel to each other, at a short distance. The space between them was filled with kindling, small dry twigs and birch bark. It was this gap that became the heart of the fire. Once the kindling caught fire, it ignited the hewn inner surfaces of the logs. The heat emanating from one log prevented the other from going out. A slow, controlled, smoldering process began, which could last 6 to 8 hours. A more complex and effective option consisted of 3 logs. 2 were laid on the ground, and the third was placed on top, in the hollow between them. This design created ideal conditions for burning and gave off heat in the right direction. The heat from such a fire was directional and very effective. It did not go up, but to the sides, along the logs. A person lay down to sleep parallel to the fire, receiving uniform heating of the whole body. For maximum effect, a heat shield was constructed on the opposite side of the sleeper. This could be a wall of poles and spruce branches or simply tightly stacked logs. The shield reflected the heat back onto the person, creating a warm cocoon. This type of fire produced almost no open flames or smoke, which was important for camouflage. It did not burn but smoldered slowly, emitting a huge amount of infrared heat. It was a real forest stove. Mastering the art of building a long fire was a sign of great experience. It allowed one to travel through the winter forest lightly, without burdening oneself with heavy skins for sleeping. It was a triumph of intelligence over the brute force of cold.
Look, the snow is deep here.
Want to know the secret that protected indigenous peoples from the most severe frosts for centuries? It was the correct use of multi-layered clothing made from processed skins. Each layer had its own specific function. The first layer, worn next to the skin, was made of thin, soft, and well-tanned hides. Its purpose was to wick moisture away from the body and create a comfortable feeling. It was the equivalent of modern thermal underwear. The second layer consisted of clothing made from thicker hides with the hair still intact. The fur facing the body created many air pockets. It was this still air that was the main insulator. Air is a poor conductor of heat, and the more air was trapped between the layers of clothing, the warmer the person was. Indigenous peoples intuitively understood this principle. They created light but very warm air armor. The outer layer of clothing was made of thick, lint-free leather or suede. Its main purpose was to protect against wind and wet snow. This clothing was durable and did not restrict movement, which was important for hunters and warriors. Special attention was paid to the feet, because frostbite during a hike meant certain death. Moccasins were made of soft leather, and a thick insole of dry moss or grass was placed inside. This material absorbed sweat and provided additional insulation. In winter they wore high moccasins, similar to boots, which were tied below the knee. They were worn over several layers of soft leather wraps. This created a multi-layered protection that kept the feet warm and dry. An important element was mittens, which were also made in multiple layers. They were much warmer than gloves, as the fingers kept each other warm. In severe frosts, they were additionally insulated with a fur lining. The cut of the clothing was loose and did not restrict blood circulation. Clothing that was too tight disrupted blood circulation and led to rapid freezing. This principle was well known and strictly adhered to. Thus, their winter costume was an entire engineering system. Each element was thought out and tested over centuries. How effective do you think such clothing was compared to modern materials? One of the most ingenious ways to keep warm at night was to use the heat stored in stones. This method did not require a constant fire and allowed you to sleep warm until morning. It turned the cold ground into a large hot water bottle. First, a large hot fire was lit at the site of the future sleeping place. While it was burning, several large flat stones were placed in it. The stones had to heat up well for an hour or two. While the stones were heating up, a place to sleep was prepared. The snow was cleared away down to the ground. A small depression was dug in the ground, corresponding to the size of a human body. When the fire burned out and the stones were hot, they were carefully removed with sticks. The hot stones were placed at the bottom of the dugout depression. This was the basis of the future warm bed. The stones were covered with a layer of earth or sand 10 to 15 centimeters thick. This layer was necessary to prevent burns and to distribute the heat more evenly. It transformed the intense heat into a gentle warmth coming from below. A thick bed of spruce branches was laid on top of this layer of earth. The needles served as additional insulation and created a soft, springy surface for sleeping. The thicker this layer was, the more comfortable the night was. A person would lie down on this multi-layered structure. The heat, slowly rising from the hot stones, would warm them from below throughout the night. It was like sleeping on a warm stove. This method was especially effective when combined with a heat-reflecting screen installed on the back side. The screen reflected body heat, and the stones warmed from below. A closed heat loop was created. Such a hot bed allowed for comfortable sleep even in severe frosts. It required a certain amount of labor, but the result was well worth it. It was a reliable and proven way to spend the night. The technique of using the heat of the earth and stones demonstrates a deep understanding of the laws of heat transfer. It is not just a trick, but a whole technology. It allowed you to get the most out of every burnt branch. What if I told you that housing architecture was one of the main tools for survival in winter? For many peoples, especially in forest areas, large communal houses, such as the longhouses of the Iroquois, were the main winter dwellings. Their design was perfectly suited for retaining heat. Such a house was a long structure with a log frame covered with bark. Several dozen people could live inside. It was this population density that was one of the secrets of heating. Several hearths were located along the central passageway of the house. Smoke from them escaped through special openings in the roof. These fires were shared and heated the entire space of the house. The heat generated by many people was a significant factor. Each person is a source of heat, with a capacity of about 100 watts. In a large house, this created a noticeable increase in temperature. The sleeping areas consisted of wide bunks arranged along the walls in 2 tiers. People slept close to each other, warming themselves with the heat of their neighbors. It was a simple and effective way to conserve heat at night. The very design of the house was aimed at minimizing heat loss. Thick walls made of bark, insulated with moss, and the absence of large windows prevented heat from escaping. The entrances were closed with thick curtains made of animal skins. The heat from the hearths rose upward, heating the upper tiers of the Nar. Therefore, it was usually warmer on the upper shelves. This space was often reserved for those who needed extra warmth. In the nomadic cultures of the Great Plains, a similar principle was applied in the teepee. Its conical shape promoted proper air circulation. Heat from the central hearth rose upward, heating the entire living space. The floor of the dwelling was always covered with a thick layer of skins and grass mats. This provided insulation from the cold ground. Walking and sitting in such a house was warm and comfortable. Thus, communal living was not only a social necessity, but also a thermal one. It allowed for fuel savings and the efficient use of body heat. What other advantages do you think this type of dwelling offered? Choosing a place to spend the night or set up a temporary camp was no less important than building the shelter itself. The right location could halve heat loss and fuel consumption. It was an art of reading the landscape. The main rule was to avoid open, windy spaces. Hilltops and wide plains were the coldest places. The wind in such areas blew away the warm layer of air near the ground. Preference was given to places with natural protection from the wind. These could be dense coniferous forests, the foot of cliffs, or steep riverbanks. Any obstacle in the path of the wind created a calm area. An experienced person always paid attention to the direction of the prevailing winter winds. They knew which side to look for shelter on. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. Lowlands and ravines provided good protection from the wind, but they had their own drawback. On clear, windless nights, the coldest air accumulated there. Therefore, for overnight stays, people chose not the very bottom of the lowland, but its slopes, slightly above the level of cold stagnation. A dense coniferous forest was considered a good place. The tree crowns blocked the snowfall, so there was less snow under them. In addition, the forest significantly weakened the force of the wind. The availability of dry fuel nearby was a critical factor. Setting up camp where there was no dry wood was a big mistake. It meant a cold night or an exhausting search for firewood in the dark. They also took into account the proximity to water, but did not settle on the ice itself or at the water's edge. Frozen bodies of water were often corridors for cold winds. It was better to choose a place a little further away, on a sheltered shore. Before making a final choice, they performed a simple test. If they went behind the intended shelter and felt that the wind had died down, the place was good. Sensations were the main tool for evaluation. Thus, the landscape was not just a backdrop, but an active element of survival strategy. The ability to find a warm pocket in it was a vital skill. It allowed you to ensure a safe night with minimal effort. Staying warm was not only related to external factors, but also to internal ones. Proper nutrition in winter was the key to maintaining a high body temperature. The body was viewed as an internal furnace that needed to be supplied with the right fuel. The basis of the winter diet was food rich in fats and proteins. Fats are the most concentrated source of energy. Their digestion generates a large amount of heat, which warms the body from within. One of the main foods for long winter trips was pemmican. It was a mixture of dried and ground meat, melted fat, and sometimes dried berries. A small piece of this product could sustain a person's strength for a whole day. Pemmican was the perfect food for survival. It was very high in calories, light, did not spoil for months, and did not require cooking. It could be eaten on the go, saving time and energy. In stationary winter camps, nuts and seeds were an important part of the diet. They also contained large amounts of fat and protein. They were harvested in summer and autumn and stored in special shelters. Hot food and drink played an important role. Even simple hot water or herbal tea helped to warm up quickly. Therefore, maintaining a fire was important not only for heating, but also for cooking. The diet also changed. In winter, people tried to eat more often, but in smaller portions. This allowed them to maintain a constant level of energy and heat production in the body. Understanding which foods provided long-lasting heat and which provided quick heat was part of traditional knowledge. Fatty foods were digested slowly, providing warmth for several hours. Simple carbohydrates provided a quick but short burst of energy. Food supplies for the winter were the main concern of every community. Successful food preparation in the fall was the key to a safe winter. The lives of all members of the community depended on it. Thus, diet was no less important for survival than warm clothing or reliable shelter. It ensured the functioning of the main heater, the human body itself. One of the main hidden dangers in the cold was moisture. Wet clothing loses its insulating properties and begins to work in reverse, taking heat away from the body. Therefore, staying dry was a top priority. The main source of moisture was sweat produced during physical activity. Therefore, indigenous peoples avoided overheating. They moved at a pace that prevented them from sweating and unbuttoned their outer clothing if it became too hot. The second source of moisture was condensation from breathing. In the confined space of the shelter, exhaled vapor settled on the walls and bedding, turning into frost. Waking up in an icy sleeping bag was extremely dangerous. A ventilation system was provided specifically to combat condensation in dwellings such as teepees. Special valves at the top allowed the draft to be regulated. Warm, moist air from breathing, and the hearth rose upward instead of settling inside. In small temporary shelters, they also tried to ensure minimal ventilation. A small opening at the top was necessary so that moist air could escape. A completely sealed shelter would be cold and damp. Clothes and shoes were dried regularly. Even if it was not possible to build a large fire, wet socks or moccasin insoles could be dried on the body by placing them under outer clothing while sleeping. Snow that fell on clothing was always shaken off before entering a warm dwelling. If this was not done, it would melt, and the clothing would become wet. Everyone knew this simple rule. The bedding in the shelter also had to be dry. Wet pine branches did not perform their insulating function. If necessary, old, damp bedding was replaced with fresh, dry bedding. They even tried to control their breathing while sleeping. Many slept covered in such a way that the air they exhaled went outside, not under the blankets. Sometimes they used a breathing tube made from a hollow plant stem for this purpose. The fight against moisture was constant and required attention to detail, but it was these details that distinguished a comfortable night from a deadly one. Dryness was synonymous with warmth. Physical training and equipment were only half the battle. Psychological preparedness for the cold was just as important. Calmness, confidence, and fearlessness were the main weapons in the arsenal of indigenous peoples. Cold was not perceived as something hostile or abnormal. It was a given, a familiar part of the world, just like the sun or rain. This acceptance helped to avoid panic and unnecessary stress. Knowledge passed down from generation to generation gave them tremendous confidence. People knew that their ancestors had lived in these conditions for centuries, and they had all the necessary skills to do the same. This experience was their main support. The ability to relax in the cold was a key skill. Tense muscles disrupt blood circulation and accelerate heat loss. Calm, even breathing, and a relaxed body, on the contrary, help to conserve energy. They listened carefully to their body's signals. A slight chill was not a cause for panic, but a signal to take action. They needed to move around, eat something high in calories, or adjust their clothing. It was a dialogue with their own bodies. Belief in their own strength and in the help of the surrounding world was of great importance. They did not feel alone in the forest. They were part of it, and this gave them mental strength. Patience was one of their main virtues. They knew how to wait, weathering bad weather in shelter, and did not act rashly. Haste in the cold often leads to mistakes. We can see that the survival of Native Americans in harsh winter conditions was not a set of tricks, but a holistic and deeply thought-out system. It was based on impeccable knowledge of nature, ingenious inventiveness, and a special philosophy of dealing with the cold. They did not just endure winter, they lived a full life in it. From building a long fire to wearing layers of clothing and using the heat of the earth, every method was perfected. This knowledge allowed them to conserve heat and energy with maximum efficiency. They proved that the main tool for survival is not technology, but the human mind. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. What else about the lives of the indigenous peoples of North America interests you? Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next explorations of the mysteries of the past.